For this project, I decided to focus on Native Americans, as this was a group that I didn't really know anything about past what we were taught in high school, which wasn't much more past the Trail of Tears and I guess the cruelty that Europeans enforced onto them. So, to begin, before they were discovered by Christopher Columbus, natives lived all across the world, and they survived off of the land. And eventually, through the areas that they lived in, they created their own cultures that differed from one another. And as such, they took on different names, such as those who lived in the poles were beginning to get called Eskimos. But for the sake of this paper, I will be focusing on Native Americans. So, one thing that I did mention in my paper was Pocahontas, as this is a story that everybody knows about, at least from Disney. So I wanted to talk about her actual story briefly. She was born in 1595, and she ended up saving John Smith from being killed by her father, her tribe. Eventually, she ends up getting captured by Captain Samuel Argall during the Anglo-Powhatan War in 1613. After this, she begins to learn English and converts to Christianity, and she eventually gets the name Rebecca instead of keeping her original one. She ends up married to John Rolfe and leaves one son behind after dying when she was about 20 something. So from this point on, well, even before it, there were a lot of wars that happened, and the Native Americans had been dragged in. For example, they were dragged into the 7 Years' War. But something I thought was important to mention was all of the treaties and different laws and acts that were signed into place, because this affected Native Americans a lot. For example, the Treaty of Hopewell, which was signed in 1785 in Georgia by, well, not really by, it was to protect Cherokee Native Americans and section off their land from the rest of America. However, the Treaty of Holston, which was signed in 1791, ended up having the Cherokee to give up their land outside of the borders that was previously established. So beforehand, while they might have had a lot more space, now they only had the area within these lines. The Indian Removal Act, signed by President Andrew Jackson, was signed, and this forced natives to have to move to the land west of the Mississippi, and supposedly it was in return for the stolen land. However, with the action of the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears was set up because President Martin Van Buren decided, it's time to get the Indians to move on faster than what they are. And because of this, there was a lot of death and heartache that the Native Americans had to experience. In 1851, the Indian Appropriations Act was created, and this is where reservations were put into play. And apparently, that I didn't know, this caused Native Americans to be unable to leave the reservation without permission. It was pretty much a jail cell because they couldn't leave unless someone's like, let them go. October 6th, 1879, the Carlisle Indian Reservation School in Pennsylvania opened its doors to the first students, and this school was created in order to kill the Indian. However, not all bad things happened, so I wanted to briefly talk about that. Charles Curtis eventually became the first Native American U.S. Senator and then Native American Vice President. This is amazing because he was the first person to ever do so, and he was also able to create leaps and bounds for his people. I didn't know this, but January 2nd, 1924, Native Americans were now able to be citizens through the Indian Citizen Act, as long as they were born within U.S. territory. But I will speak about that later. President Barack Obama signed the Native American Apology Resolution in 2009. This gave many natives a settlement, and according to legendsofamerica.com, they stated that the Native Americans have been swindled out of royalties overseen by the Department of the Interior since 1887. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot more history to go into, but I just wanted to talk briefly on that. So, some physical features that the Native Americans have that are very recognizable is, first and foremost, the long, dark hair. Many of the males and females and other genders in this race have long, dark, silky hair. They also tend to have high cheekbones, and their skin color ranges from light brown all the way to dark brown. Something interesting that I found out was that most Native Americans are hairless, and this is kind of why they aren't able to grow a beard. The few that do have hair, at least lots of it, is usually due to a hormonal imbalance. So looking into their beliefs was a little difficult, as most of the things done by Native Americans was passed down orally and through the generations, so it wasn't really written down. However, one of the top things was nature. They believed in revering nature and also treating it with kindness. It's something we live off of, but it's also something that needs to be held in high regard. According to Dialogue Institute, they believed in animism, which is the belief that a living spirit resides in all living things and not living things. Animals, materials, elements in nature, such as the sun and moon, all have their own spirit. Stereotypes are still held towards this race. One of the top things being that they were considered to be savages, at least back in European times. Something interesting that I found was, according to Ferris.edu, a colonist, Ruth Hopkins, stated, "Some folks contend that it's acceptable to dress up as a cowboy. They should get a pass for dressing up as an Indian. Wrong. While children frequently dress up to play a cowboy, nurse, or firefighter, these are occupations. Being American Indian is not a profession or vocation. It is a human identity and tribally specific and integral to Native parenthood or personhood and nationhood." And this was one of my wow moments, because I had never really thought about what one's ethnicity holds for a person, and and the way that their clothing and the way that they appear, that is valued to them. So, and it's important to keep in mind that being Native American isn't a choice. It's something that people is born with, and as such, they get born into that history and have to feel the weight that their ancestors have felt. The final wow moment that I had was when I learned that Native Americans weren't even citizens until the 1920s. And I was surprised, because they were born and raised here in America, but they still were not considered citizens just because of the color of their skin or the differences that their race had compared to Europeans or Spanish. So learning about this group is interesting. It allowed me to open up some doors and see how much they have and continue to suffer under the United States and white people. Um, but I hope that people continue to remember that everyone is human, and as such, they experience different things. Thank you.